kind of join in as we get going. Yeah, thanks for joining us. So I'm really excited about this. Both of your books are great. They address familial histories and identity, and sense of place, in very different and parallel ways. Vanessa, in the offshore, in the Great Offshore Grounds, you sort of take us through this journey as two sisters try to find, kind of find out this family secret. And as I said, it's been really fulfilling, that sort of travel itch. And then in Northernmost, we sort of get this intergenerational story of a family, like it's like two parallel identity crises almost. And sort of how we create the sense of our own history. So I'm really excited to see where you all go with this. I want to add, so for those that are tuning in, there's a Q&A function as part of the webinar. So if you have any questions that sort of pop up while this is going on, please feel free to make use of that. And I will ask them at the end, or at the end as we're sort of wrapping up. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them there. And I'll do my best to read through them and get them all asked. I will also put some links to both of the books in the chat. So if you're so inclined, you can go check those out. We ship all over the country, and we do have a pickup window. So you are welcome to select either of those options. All right, so I'll get into a bit about our authors. Vanessa Veselka is the author of the novel Zazen, which won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and has had nonfiction in GQ, The Atlantic, Smithsonian, The Atavist, and was included in Best American Essays and the anthology Bitch Fest, 10 Years of Cultural Criticism. She has been at various times a teenage runaway, a sex worker, a union organizer, an independent record label owner, a train hopper, a waitress, and a mother. She lives in Portland, Oregon. And I will add that the Great Offshore Grounds has been selected to the National Book Award long list, which is so exciting. So we're really happy to have you here tonight. And Peter Geye is born and raised in Minneapolis, lives here with his family. And his previous novels are Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, and Wintering. So I'll disappear and let you two take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks to Moon Palace for being such a great part of the Minneapolis community, the book selling and literary community. You guys are right at the top, and I'm so thankful to be virtually visiting with Vanessa. I want to be the first in to say congratulations, Vanessa. It's so exciting what's happened for you, and I can't even imagine the excitement. And it's just such a worthy occurrence. It's such a terrific book, and I'm really looking forward to talking tonight. I think what Vanessa and I have talked about doing is we're each going to read a couple of short sections, just a couple of minutes at a time, and we'll get a conversation started that way. We've done an event in the past, not too long ago, and what ended up happening is that we just gabbed on and on for, I think it was almost 2 hours. So we'll try to do that. What's that?
I said we won't do that tonight.
Right. But Vanessa's going to get us started. She's going to read a short section from her book, and then we'll just jump into a conversation. So take it away, Vanessa.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, this is, I'll just read it. Cheyenne sat in the temp office watching the woman behind the desk peel the label gum off a bottle of hand sanitizer. The lobby was empty. The daily work assignments had been dispersed and all the other new applicants processed. Cheyenne was the last appointment of the day, and she had to make a big show and cry to get the slot. Now she sat in a burnt orange upholstered chair covered in brown stains, watching a reality show about people getting mangled on crab boats. It was interrupted every few minutes by teasers for the news, a record of half-hearted diplomatic gestures, the traditional mating dance of war gods, some updates on general cruelty, and, inexplicably, a picture of a beach. Then it was back to the crab boat and someone in a yellow spacesuit getting swept off the deck into an Arctic swell. She looked down at her application and saw a job history comparable to any intellectually ambitious recovering meth head. newspaper delivery, nonprofit program director, bookstore clerk, nonprofit program director again, university administrative assistant, Christmas retail, university administrative assistant's lackey, study skills tutor, bad wife. Then there was a murky period of off-grid employment that wasn't worth explaining. She turned in the form and went back to her spot on the chair. And radar was at least a direction. Cheyenne was surprised that Livy had agreed to go and find her, but Livy had set the bar for the trip at $1,000, an impossible amount. Get your half of the money together and we'll go. Complicating further, Anne was no longer in Montana. They had spoken to the abbot there, and the only lead they had was Shaky, a woman who might have once been Anne, who was now at a monastery in Boston. They called to see if she was there and were told that she was, and that was enough for them. 3 weeks after the wedding, though, they were no closer to making the trip. It would be the same in a month or 2 or 3, unless Cheyenne started to make some money. At 5 o'clock, people started to leave the temp office. At a quarter after, the associate placement counselor called Cheyenne back into the administrative catacombs. The associate sat her down, reviewed her clipboard, and told Cheyenne she had a wonderful future in servitude, if she had just could get the right outlook, which she didn't have. Cheyenne made it through with her eager face on, though barely. The counselor congratulated on her wealth of hard-won but unrelated skills. We'll call you for sure. Meanwhile, get some slacks. The bus came and Cheyenne got on, but couldn't face going back to the apartment. Instead, she went to find Essex. There was no one better to complain about work with. The idea of it, the reality of it, the lack of it, because on all our tombstones, it will surely say, R.I.P. independent contractor. Most likely, they'll write it on a billboard over a mass grave as deep as a valley. Essex, at least, would find that funny.
So terrific. And it reminds me of one of the great sort of enduring memories and recollections I have of this book. It's been, it's a book that I first read a long time ago. And then again, more recently, when we set these events up. And both times, one of the things that struck me most was this sense of these characters, and I'm talking not just about Cheyenne in that scene, but Essex throughout the story, and Livy in her own way, and of course Kristen, the girls, the young women's mother, I might say, how all of them just are constantly sort of striving and battling to make ends meet, and the endurance that takes, the agony that it wreaks on a person's spirit and heart. And I wonder if we can begin with that, because it occurs to me, and I don't know why it didn't occur to me before now, but when I was listening to Moon Palace talk about your biography, how it seems there's maybe a similarity between the endurance required of the characters in this book and maybe the endurance that's been required of you in your own life. And how does the experience of putting that down and of thinking about who we are professionally, indentured servants, maybe all. I love that image of the billboard over a deep mass grave. How does that feature in the book in your mind? How do you make sense of it at the end of the book, at the end of Cheyenne and Livy's life, and from where you sit now?
Well, some of it, when I was writing, it was just instinctual that, I've worked a lot of these jobs and I did not work them for, experience to write about. I worked them for money. And, I think that one of the things that we may get into a little more later, but that goes with that, so you have the grind of what it's like to always be worrying and worrying and worrying. And I can count on one hand the number of months in my life where I have not been worried about the bills. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's something that's always there, right? And for many people. And so there's that kind of grind, and the characters have that. And then there's this force of vitality that's moving them. And I think that the part that I was really interested in with this novel is one of the big differences, and Kirsten, the mom, actually makes this you know, she figures this out in a way, which is she's looked around and she's seen people who were born into a lot more privilege. And she's like, what they have is a personal myth. What they have is the belief that they can do something great. This idea that they're the center of their movie. They're right. This idea that like, it's all part of going somewhere. It's going somewhere, right? And so she tries to instill this sort of Joseph Campbell, like mythical abuse in them a little bit, like, you know, to try to, she wants to give them and instill in them the idea that there can be greatness, right? And to go back to that, I mean, years and years ago, and I think it's East of Eden, it may be Grapes of Wrath, I'm 99% sure it's East of Eden, but I read them both simultaneously in a certain period, just like right through. But they're talking about, it was Tom Joad, but they're talking about that sense of greatness. Like, could somebody come up to their own sense of greatness? And did they have that in them or did they not have that in them? And I think, you know, Kirsten's trying to install that in her kids, this sense that they could be something, right? Because what happens at the point of being ground down to nothing and shaping a life is the story you tell yourself about what that experience is. So then what happens when it doesn't turn out that way? You know, what happens when the simple stories like that, like, oh, you're going to make it, you know, oh, this is all leading somewhere, when they really pray, they don't have any real meaning. And that's a lot of where these characters are at, this question of what do you do at that point? Do you remake the story? Do you, you know, reinvent? Do you settle for something else, pretend you never had that story? Do you, you know what I mean? Like, how do you interact in that? Because that's the big difference. So these characters, to me, that's that interaction of myth and of that grind and the struggle that I think they have, and I think they sort of valiantly take on in different ways. Although I've been told my characters are also very unlikable at times. So, you know, depending on your taste, I have a love of fuck ups. This question about, you know, how are you really ready to be naked without that story? Are you really ready to like let that go? And I don't mean in some like Zen, like, because that's another story, right? Like I'm going to enlightenment and I have understood this and I am detaching. I don't mean, yeah. I just mean in that way, like, are you really ready to be that naked in late capitalist America, you know, in this moment in time? So yeah, so I don't know if I answered any question.
Yeah, and it inspires another question to me, and I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about Cheyenne and Livy's father, Cyril, who is sort of the antithesis in every way of the mothers, which is to say he's incredibly wealthy, incredibly detached, I mean, altogether detached from their lives. And yet he still feels, whether it's because he's wealthy or because he's a man, that he has some authority over their lives. And he can, it's almost like he bestows them this gift in the opening, not the opening scene. I guess it is the opening scene of the book, the opening couple of chapters of the novel, at his wedding to a much younger woman. Of course, the most predictable thing in the world that a man like that would do. And it occurs to me that, and then he sort of, you know, he's more like a shadow that's cast over the novel than a character who regularly appears. But so often I thought about the contrast between everything he has, which is the world, materially, and everything that Livy and Cheyenne and Kirsten have, which is nothing materially, right. Yet how much more noble and inspiring and righteous their lives seem than his, which is, I guess, one way of saying they're better. Whether they're likable or not, who cares? It's a question of nobility is too strong of a word, but their morality and their nature and their character is so much more alive and so much more interesting, at least from where I sit. I mean, they're impossibly dynamic and smart and not ambitious in a way that's like they want to be Cyril, but ambitious in a way that they want their lives to have meaning and they want to be some version of happiness, which is not like they don't want the white picket fence, neither of them do, but they want to know the things that are important in life. They want the wisdom of their mothers. They want the love that exists between all of them in this way that makes their search. And they're both really on just terrific quests in their own right. But it's so much more noble than that mythos that you generate with Cyril, which is the Gatsby-esque, I have the world, but you're just hopelessly empty.
Well, and the thing about Cyril that's interesting that you bring it up, because it is that thing. I mean, he's essentially a sperm donor, right? Like his role in the novel is essentially, and I envisioned him as, the person who throws the jerk who throws the golden apple that says for the fairest, that starts things off, who has absolutely no interest in what happens, the chaos that follows the wars. I was doing an interview with somebody who was a man, and we were having a really good conversation, but one of the places that we got stuck was about the character of Cyril. And he had said, so Cyril is, he's a man, he's a jerk, he's man, he's like, is this some statement on gender? I said, no, not at all. I was thinking really more of class, but I said that, and I said, he's really not that important in the book, right? He really kind of in that first chapter, and he's kind of gone. And he said, well, but he's central to the book. He said, no, the book would never happen without him. It's all coming from him. And I thought, oh my God, where does the sperm donor idea, here's this guy who just appears in this one thing. And yet, somebody could talk about it as being the center of the book, or the center. And that's so strange. And about how we view things and where we see the beginning of a story, right? And so yeah, I think that I wasn't trying to set them up in a really cartoonish, rich people are bad, poor people are good. It was more specific in his character than that.
I certainly hope I didn't make it sound like it was.
No, I don't think you did.
No, because I think it's brilliant. I mean, it's one of the things that I admire most about the novel is that I mean, first of all, the authenticity with which Cheyenne and Livy, venture forth is it's awe-inspiring. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. I read their lives and I was like, oh my God, there's so much that we need to think about as human beings on this planet. There's so much that we need to understand better. And I wonder, so there's that part of it, but there's, I wonder, and I don't know, maybe you have a better sense of this with respect to that interviewer, but is that just a case where there is the part of a not inconsiderable part of our country that regardless of whatever other qualities somebody has, they see a character like him, like Cyril, and think, okay, he's the first pillar of this story and an important pillar of this story because of his wealth and because of his paternity and whatever other qualities that they ascribe to him.
Yeah, I mean, patriarchy lives on. I mean, it was a good conversation, and I'm not to disparage the person I was having it with. It was just one of those places where you got stuck. I went back and forth a couple of times, then I quit. But it was interesting to see that, and I thought about it as that sperm donor thing, and that's why I kept coming. I was like, this, the different ways you would perceive of somebody being central or where the stories start. But in talking about myth, I'm gonna put it back on you because I don't want to. Okay. So I want you to do a reading, and we can get back to other stuff about my book later.
Well, I'm gonna do a reading also, of course, and I'm gonna read from a section in the book. It's about a third of the way through the book, and I think that it actually has some parallels with what we're talking about. The lives that we live as stories, and stories that need to be told, or we need to tell ourselves or understand in some context outside of the lived experience, which is, I think, a part of what both Livy and Cheyenne are doing in their own ways. But in this case, Odiner, one of the main characters in Northernmost, has just returned to his native home in Arctic Norway, and after a harrowing misadventure halfway to the North Pole, and already one day into his return, there are people trying to get at him for the story, and they've just had this big feast with a man at a man's house, who's the sort of the Cyril of Hammerfest Norway in 1897, and there's a newspaper man there from Tromsø asking for his story. He set his fork down. This story can't be told in a day. It likely can't be told in a week. I'll need my assistant and secretary, the typist, the portraitist. All of those people live in Tromsø. You have my word we'll take good care of Lord Einar. We'll also make sure he returns as quickly as possible. He waited for Inger's response. I was less patient myself. Herr Granerud, I said, I'm still unclear why anyone would want to know the first thing about what happened to me. Again, he considered his words carefully before saying, did you not hear your own words just now? Because we all did. He swept an arm around the table. What we learned after Nansen's triumphant return is that there's no limit to people's eagerness for stories of survival, especially in the polar climes. The mere idea of all that cold and ice, the darkness and danger, why, it stirs our souls. You've got the impetus of that frightful bear on top of it all. The adventure, Bengt added, more sodded now even than a minute earlier. The adventure is part of it, to be sure, Granerud conceded, but people aren't as interested in accomplishments as one might think. You mean to say Nansen's achievement is that he went to a cold place? Bengt scoffed, slurping the end of his glog in one sloppy pull. These windy men, they want to be heard no matter what they're shouting. Nansen is no ordinary person, Granerud said. He's even more popular than the king. But I'm a common man, I said, hoping that might put the matter to rest. Less than that, I'd say, Bengt was quick to chortle. All eyes turned to him, whether to scold him or to laugh along, I couldn't tell, but he was right, so I echoed him. Less than that. This is why your story is important, Granerud whispered, why people will love to hear it, precisely because you're exactly what you say. I must have looked flummoxed. And yet, here you are, he said with an urgency in his voice that I recognize now as pleading. Inger must have heard the same thing because she said, Herr Granerud, please. You know that my husband has had but one night home. Look at him. He's as lean as a schoolboy. He could hardly be expected to make the trip to Tromsø or to recount his story before regaining his strength. She paused, wiped her lips, and laid her napkin beside her plate. And I could hardly be expected, after so long an absence, to be without him more. At this, Gerd shot her a piercing look, which Inger pretended not to notice. I know just the thing, Granerud said. You'll join your husband, Faride. Both of you will come to Tromsø. You must. You can comfort him there as well as here. And I'll stop there.
You know what's really interesting about hearing you read that, because I've read that section a couple of times now, and it's so, it reminds me so much, you know, when you're talking about modern media, so much about this sort of, you know, obsession for reality TV, like this obsession with story that wants authenticity and wants it in a very particular curated way. And all of these questions of, and of course he needs the money, right? Like I mean, that's the big driver for him to tell this story, isn't the sense of like, I'm great and I've got to tell my adventures. It's very much like, I need the 100, what is it? What's the currency?
100 kroner, yep.
Kroner, thank you.
Yep.
I need the 100 kroner, you know, and like that's, so there's this, again, this trade, which is something you and I both, I think, written about, this idea of how do you have to whore out your personal charms or your story or your this to get something, right? Whether it's on a resume or whether it's 100 kroner. And I find that all of that really comes through in such a subtle way in that, because you have Bengt, who is, as you said, sort of the Cyril of that. He's the rich person who spends his time stealing people's dignity, you know what I mean, rather than giving it or offering it, even though he could.
Right.
And you have, you know, you have this newspaper man, and you also have this moment, which is not in the reading, but which is so interesting. And I think this is what's so interesting about your work, is that this person has come back from the dead, being believed to be dead. And the reaction of his wife is so different than what you would expect. And the sort of just discomfort about it that is carrying through is also in that conversation. I mean, I know it because I know I've read other, I've read the book,
Right.
but like, it's also in that conversation in a way that she sort of intervenes, and it doesn't feel like she's intervening because she really wants to be with him, or she wants, like there's just sort of a weird, we have business to sort out, like kind of distancing around it. But I don't know, is that correct? Was that
I think that it is correct. Yes. I mean, I think that where Inger, his wife, finds herself throughout, I mean, certainly through the end of the scene that I just read from, and even further into the book, even once they get to Tromsø and he starts to tell Marius that's the story that he has, there's a great reluctancy on her part, on, I think, multiple levels, in terms of how quickly she wants to embrace either him or the story that he's telling or the money that he's about to make from this. And I think that, in my mind at least, a big part of that reluctance is based on the fact, and she never says this in the book, so it's just my memory of writing her, but there was, I imagined that there was a sense of relief when she heard that he was dead, and that now she only had herself to worry about. She didn't have to worry about his, his suffering, his lack of dignity. She didn't have to worry about his own ambition, which is, it's a very modest and I think sort of noble ambition. But she would have been alone. She would have been her own self after what has been a pretty long struggle with poverty. They've sent their daughter off to the States, and they have never heard from her again. And all of the loneliness that attends her life throughout this, until they finish in Tromsø and he finishes telling his story. All of that, she, as most women are still, I think, even in many cases, meant to suffer that alone. She of course she can have her feelings about her daughter being gone and the lack of spark and romance with her husband and their poverty and all of those things. But that's a woman, take that and go inside and bake a loaf of bread and contemplate that. That's how she would have, that's what would have been expected of her. Whereas Ode Einar has this sense, like he gets this job offer to sail away with one of the great heroes of the time, truly one of the heroes of the time, at least as far as the media would have been concerned, the reality TV aspect of this, who's this great Norwegian hero who picks him, and he feels a sense of like, not accomplishment. He knows it's not accomplishment, but terrific luck. And here's my chance to spread my wings and to soar in a way that men are supposed to be able to soar.
Right.
Which is of course ridiculous. He's an impoverished, totally bankrupt fisherman with a boat that doesn't even float anymore. I mean, he should be patching that up. And so that's a very long answer. I understand, but a very long way of getting back to, she doesn't know what is going on. Like her emotions and her self-awareness in that moment have got to be like staggering, right? Like, what has just happened? I grieved him. He was gone. I prayed for him while he was gone, and now he's dead, and now he's alive again. And this roller coaster of emotion leaves her sitting there like, and now there's all these men asking him for more. And I don't think she's the sort of character who would have thought, what about me? She's not saying, what about me in that moment when she says, he can't possibly be expected to go. What she's thinking is, this story that you're after is a story that exists for us. Like, I've got to know that. And later she says that, like, this is our lives. And if I'm going to get back into this, to the lane of traffic where we live together and are happy together and rekindle our romance and make a meaningful life together, like, I'm going to need to know what happened, and I'm going to need to know that, you know, like, that's mine. I get that. That's
Intimate
mine.
way, and not have to read about it in the
Right.
paper.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Which she doesn't get.
Right. Right.
Right. In a way. And so, I mean, the other thing I'd throw into that mix is, you know, you're a parent, I'm a parent. I know that one of the senses of being a mom for me was realizing that my solitude was gone forever, because I would always have part of me that was hyper aware of my child, no matter where they were.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of just, I don't mean freedom to just do what I want, but the sense of being contained by myself in the world was gone. Yep. And that wasn't an entirely wonderful feeling. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That there was part of that was also a loss. It was, you know, it was, and I thought about that. I played it in writing. I was trying to understand it a little more when my daughter was young. And I was sort of trying to understand it through a character whose daughter was sick, you know, and this sort of back and forth between where, and so I can imagine that, you know, her daughter's gone. She's closer than he is to presuming that she may be dead. Mm-hmm. She is now moved into that space with him, and he's back. And so that solitude that she is starting to come to terms with is threatened. Yeah. And not only that, if he's back, then what of her daughter? Like there's all of a sudden she's bound back up into everything. Right. Yeah, I'm glad you read that. It's let's talk. I want to continue to talk about ambition if you're. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll read a small section and then let's talk about ambition.
Okay.
This is pretty short. It's later on. This is the character of Cheyenne is in Texas and penniless and at a stranger's house, and he's been building a bizarre, he's a castle, like a small, he's a mason. He's giving her a tour. He's Czech. He pulled aside the curtain and sun poured across the floor. Cheyenne walked to the center of the tower room. It was an octagon, and each side was not a wall but a window, tall and Gothic, filled with daytime. The floor was a parquet of handmade starburst tiles, like she'd seen in the workroom. It's not finished, of course, he said, but she could feel his pride like a wounded animal breathing behind her. Vaulted arches rose 30 feet above the ground to meet in an 8-way cross at the top. From there, blue and white tile formed a star whose point almost touched the peak of the empty window frames. Light was everywhere, and it came in from all sides. On the wall in front of her was a kaleidoscope of gold and pomegranate red, amethyst and dragonfly green light. She turned to see where it had come from. On the south-facing side of the tower, high above the roof of the great hall, was a stained glass window. The bottom was made of thin panels that used elements of Alhambra geometry inside a carnival barrage of color, nothing uniform, no hues alike, no two hues alike. Above it was a circle with a rose in it. The petal had been constructed of busted-up pool table lampshades and opaque ballet slipper pink transoms and side lights salvaged off tacky suburban doors. The rose reminded her more of a heavy metal tattoo than something from Eden, yet it was exquisite in its diligence. As if it had been a real rose dipped into nitrogen and shattered into shards, each piece of all that was worth it in the world, collected by the mason to make it whole again. The national flower of Czechoslovakia, he said, now Czech Republic and Slovakia. We cut it in half like a baby. I hate these stupid ideas. We are done with our tour. We have a snack. He took a mandarin and a Granny Smith apple out of his jacket. Like I said, she's not finished, he said. He handed Cheyenne the mandarin and, taking out his knife, cut the skin off an apple in a single waxy spiral. Will you keep making these things? Cheyenne asked. He shrugged. She ate the mandarin wedge and tried to put it into words, which she was thinking. When did you get okay with being nothing? She asked. He scraped the apple peels into a pile on the floor with the back of his knife. I'm sorry, she said. It's all right. I'm not mad. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, sure, I know what you mean. Just this, not having to explain. Something fell from her shoulders. Building the castle helps, he said. It's good to have something to do that is very hard but has no point. So I thought that's a cross section for both of our works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and more than that too, I had the like a freaky hairs on the back of my neck moment listening to you read that. First of all, I think that that is of the many scenes in novels that I've read this year, that scene remains for me one of the most vivid and striking and just amazing. And it was if I hadn't known by the time I got to that point, in the Great Offshore Grounds, I knew that I was totally giving myself over to you. But it makes me think about something. And maybe because this has been on my mind lately, and this has, I guess it's only tangentially related to work. And I hope you don't mind me asking you this question. But it occurs to me how much the description of that and their conversation, the brief conversation that you read there, how much that resembles the work that we do if we're talking about writing novels. Like how like the castles in the middle of Texas literary novels, or any novels, really are at this stage in American life, which is to say, not, I mean, there must be a reason that we do this that is related to the reason that he's building that he's building that castle, with all of its imperfections and all of its sort of tackiness, but still the resplendent beauty of it. I'm like, that's what we do.
Well, and I think with all artists in general, this question of ambition in art is a really difficult and dangerous one. On the one hand, you have this idea that you're not supposed to care. On the other hand, you can't monetize it. You know what I mean? Like, you have to figure out how you do what you do. And every artist in the world that I've ever known is always working 2 to 3 jobs, because the game is always, how do you buy the time to do it?
Yep.
And that is true of whether you're driving cab and like raising a kid and trying to write something, or whatever other things you have. But like, the difference, I think, with the arts is that it's not valued, right? So it's, why are you spending your time on this, instead of a second job that makes money? Or why are you, I mean, there's all these pressures around it. And so you come back to where we started, which is, how do you tell yourself the story of meaning, right? How do you tell yourself, I'm here in the story and I will be here someday, or I will not be here someday. And yet the thing that Yershi, the character in there that I've come to believe in really is, somebody asked me once when I was doing a workshop, and it was one of those very tender questions that people will come with, where they come and they bring you your work, or they ask you, it's like, tell me, do I have it, right? Like, do I have the thing? Mm-hmm. Which is not something anybody can say to you, right? And I remember sitting down with this young man, and like, I was trying to say something that I think was not where he was at, and I ended up being able to like fix it. But at first I was like, oh my God, I traumatized the guy. But I said, if you can quit, you should. And I said, let me explain what I mean. That I would say that to any artist. If you are capable of quitting, you should. Most artists find that they have quit over and over and over, and they learn eventually they are not capable of it. And through that, they learn what their real relationship is to it. And Yershi is a mason, and he is an artist, and he is doing his thing. And yet he knows it is not going to come to anything. He doesn't have any belief, like wasn't in what I read, but she's like, couldn't you make weird stained glass for rich people? And he was just like, sure, but not really. You know what I mean? Like, the time it takes to make anything never monetizes, right? To really make something, it never monetizes. And that is true for him. He would end up having to cut corners and duplicate what he did over and over to make it meaningless to monetize it. And yet at the same time, I think the only thing we can fairly trade out of that is that ambition. The ambition has to change. The ambition has to be the work. And And that's the failure that really hurts too, right? If you go out and you say, this, is the hardest, this is the thing I want to try, this is what I want to make, and you fail that's very lonely. It can shake you to your core. People stop making things when they do that, right? So they try not to choose something quite that big. You know what I mean? Like there's a way we mediate it constantly, but what we're afraid of is that story. Like, and so that was the question of like, when did you get okay with being nothing? So yeah, I mean, I do see it as very related to art.
Yeah, there's another sort of another river of thought that comes off of this for me, which is that there's Hiroshi, and he's he's making a living in the way that an artist would make a living, which is to say he does the odd job. He's actually, I think when we're in this scene, has passed on a job because he knows that if he takes that job that will pay him money, then he won't be able to do the work around the castle that he wants to do. And so he's committed in that way, and yet he is terrifically self-aware. So all of that's happening, and meanwhile here comes Cheyenne, who's just lost her car. She's basically, I mean, she's a traveler without any mode of transportation, but she's in a way that it's only occurring to me now, and that's one of the things that I love about this book, is that I continue to think about it in all these ways, is that she's trying to make of her life what he is of the castle. That is to put all the pieces back together, to not to make something beautiful in the in the aesthetic sense, but in the soulful sense, to make sense of where she came from, who her mother really is, what that means to her and her sister, what that means to her and Kirsten, whether Kirsten or Justine is her real mother. Like, how are these things all going to make sense? And she is doing, with these kind of half-ass materials, the same thing that he's doing with the castle in the middle of Texas, which is beautiful. Not that she would necessarily see that, although she's so smart, she probably, if she's not seeing it then, she's going to see it down the road. Sorry for the pun, but she's going to recognize it somewhere down the road. And I mean, I love that, both in my own work and in the books that I read, when those things, like, I don't know where this idea came from. I mean, I do know, but like when you decided you were going to put the castle and Hiroshi into the novel, and like where it was going to go and how it was going to fit in there, but the reverberations of it in so many interesting ways. I mean, it's like that shattered rose that now is being put back together by the Mason, and that's you putting together this novel of Cheyenne and her shattered life and all of that stuff coming. It's just so wonderful and so organic in the story. I just love it. Yeah.
Well, and I don't want to suck up all the air in this particular event. I want to talk about these things in regards to your work as well, because you do a lot of, in a very different way. You're also looking at this. What does ambition mean? It's cost, it on a lot. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know I said it backwards. I'm a little bit sleepy today. I've been up since 4. So, but it's cost him a lot, and it's cost his family a lot. And there is that quality of ambition, of the luck of being chosen, of like, here's his chance too. But that ambition doesn't seem to be there when he goes to tell his story. It doesn't seem to be like, so something has changed in that. But then the ambition appears again in his decision to sail later. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you want to read another section, or do you want to just jump in and talk about that?
I'll just jump in and talk about it. And I'm so glad you asked that, because it's not something that I've talked a lot about since the book came out. But what happens is that and I don't think I'm just going to describe it. I don't care if people have read the book or not. But so he and Inger, his wife, after their time in Tromsø, after he's recounted this story, after he has, paid his debt and gotten himself back onto his feet, they've settled into what to me seems a kind of idyllic life. They're not hungry anymore. They're not homeless anymore. They're still living very simply and very frugally, but they have this quiet life now. And even though Odd Einar has not stopped thinking about his daughter, not by any stretch of the imagination, he has, in my mind anyway, he has sort of resigned himself to the fact that if he's going to see her again, it's going to be up to him. And this is the only thing that's left for him now that they're back on their feet. The only ambition, to use that word again, that he has left, which is, I want to see my daughter. I'll just keep grinding, another word that we've used, until I'm able to do that. And of course, it's totally foolhardy to believe that he might actually accomplish that, which is to see his daughter. But he gets at the end of the book, he gets a letter he thinks it's from her. It's not from her. It's from a character named Hosea Grimm, who was her sort of benefactor in Minnesota when she arrives, when Odd Einar's daughter Thea arrives there. And he's suddenly, he's full of vim and vigor again. He's got a grandson in the bargain, one named after him. He's so excited to reconnect with that. And then but still no practical way of getting there. Not by any stretch of the imagination, as I said. And so but then his wife passes away. And so he suddenly finds himself in the position that she found herself in at the beginning of the book, which we've talked about already, which is alone and like solitary and the sole provider of ambition in his life, as she was the sole provider of ambition in her life. And he makes a choice that he's going to go. And I don't know what readers have thought about that. I haven't talked with enough of them about his choice, but he's got this fishing boat that doesn't work, that he's now made work, that part of the reconciliation of his life was to get his boat back in order. And so he's been out fishing, and he's going to use that boat to cross the North Atlantic and go to America. And of course it's as foolhardy as any thought he ever had. And there's a part of me that believes he made it.
Right.
In my mind, and I don't think I don't think even under the best possible circumstances that vessel would carry that man across that sea. But there's a part of me, and it's one of my favorite parts about this book is the not knowing that, is that I set him on a course. He leaves his village behind for the only thing that still matters to him, which is to lay eyes on his daughter again, and to hear her laughter and to see her. And I think that this comes interestingly around to what you were saying about when you had a child yourself, and how complicated and mysterious that is. For myself, the thing that overwhelmed me at first was that I didn't know that I could love someone like that. I was like in abject misery most of the time because I was sleep deprived and I couldn't do the work that I wanted to do, and it was so all of those things. But at the same time, I just knew that my life was changed because of the love that I felt for my children. And that's what I was thinking about as he sets off on that course. And I don't think I believe this except in the poetic sense of it, but like, does that love safely get him across the ocean? Like it got him safely across Spitsbergen when he was, almost dead several times there. And so there's like, is he just that character whose luck just persists and he gets
Right.
there. And it's that feeling, and to me, it's a feeling of like hopefulness and happiness that I don't often allow the characters in my book, or myself for that matter. But that's where he is at the end of that story. And I mean, what he's sailing into, I don't know, and I'm happy not to know, but I love that there's a part of me that believes he maybe made it. Now, what he finds when he gets there is another matter,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, right. I
yeah,
have that same feeling about Livy at the end
yeah,
of,
yeah,
you know, like I do. So I understand that. I also think it's interesting, and although I don't know if we have, I don't think we have questions, but if we do, somebody should jump in and tell us, or shut us up, or give us a, a hook.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there are any questions. We'll give people a couple minutes to ask them, but if you guys just want to keep talking, I'm loving your conversation. So yeah, please
Okay.
go on. We'll see if anyone has it, and maybe wrap up in the 5-10 minutes. If
sure.
Yeah,
no
sounds
questions
great.
arise. Okay, cool.
So one of the things, and this is more of a writing question thing, Peter, is, you've read stories and I've read stories, everybody's read stories, where the ending isn't, where it could go either way, right? Like they could live or they could die.
Yep.
Jump off the cliff, or they could, whatever. And sometimes those are very, very frustrating. And I think that where that doesn't work is where the writer doesn't have a sense of which way it goes. I know when I've talked to people about it, it's like, you don't get out of the question. You know what I mean? Like as the author, you have to have an instinct for where you think that goes, because that's part of your job to understand that choice, so that, like, even if it's not certain, there's an inclination. Because if you're just doing it, because a lot of times it reads like, oh, you couldn't make the choice. You wanted to double dip and you couldn't make the choice. So like, and I feel like that comes across as, to me, when I read stories like that, I feel like they're really frustrating. And I've worked with people and said, like, hey, fine if you don't say, but you have to know. Like, you have to know. And it's not even a formal knowing or a definitive knowing, but a sense of, like, like what you just said. And I feel it's the same thing. It's like, no, my instinct is totally that it went this way,
Right.
Right. And you lean into that. There's all these things about writing where, I don't know how, but the sort of juju of the leaning into something just carries, and you can't find it at the sentence level, but somehow there's an orientation or an inclination that does appear after time. And I don't really know how to talk about it, but it seems to me that that's something. Has that been your experience, or how do you think about endings?
Yeah, I think we share a sensibility with respect to that. And in fact, as you were describing that, I was thinking about what I often tell my own students, who will sometimes say something like, well, the reader can decide. And my response to that is usually something like, well, sure. And yeah, you want to invite them to play along.
Right.
But exactly what you said, you've got to know, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be black or white, yes or no, but what is you need to understand, especially at the ending of a book, but also at the beginning of a book, either what came before to get us to the starting point, or what comes after we get to the end point. And for myself, I mean, I think I'm trying to think to the endings of my, there's ambiguity in the ending of all of my stories. It's not just the books. And for me, the appeal, or what's attractive about that ambiguity, is I feel like it mirrors real life. And that's not always the barometer by which I measure things in the, but I want there to be, like, I'm one of the things that makes me happiest about in life is the mystery of it all, right? Like, I don't know what the hell is going to happen, kind of about anything, with very few exceptions. And so I always feel like that's a realistic ending. But I guess with the possible exception of Odiner, who in my mind when I wrote that end, I knew, of course, he died. Of course, he didn't survive, or he didn't make it to America in that boat. Maybe he was rescued, or maybe, you know, he only got to the other side of the island and he had to park it, and now he's still, you know, living under his boat there. But I knew that that was what was happening. You know, something.
Well, you knew that the intention was clear.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Well, exactly. Exactly. But the possibility exists, in my tender heart loves to believe that actually it did happen. And I think, I don't know, maybe that's just weak sauce, and I have failed the ending of the book. But I'll tell you that I was just thinking about this morning when I was walking my dog, and I use that time, you know, just to sort of unspool my thoughts and whatever. And I was thinking, one of the things that keeps you doing this, because I've been having this trouble, like, I love writing novels. I don't ever want to do anything else. It's so hard to do and to make a living and, you know, all of those things. But I was like, why do you keep doing it? Why is it so important to you to do it? And I was just thinking about that, and I was like, you know, one of the things that's true is how much I covet the life of my characters, no matter how dire their lives, no matter how complicated, no matter how unhappy, no matter how lonesome they are, whatever they might be, I covet the experience of their life. And like, I can't live without that. Like that's so much a part of how I then make sense of the world. And
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, and so it's like, I need that. It's like, you know, some people need to get up and go for a run every morning, or they feel adrift. Some people need to, you know, make $1 million a year, or they feel adrift. I need to have the vicarious experience, the covetous experience that I have of living with these characters. And you can get it from books too, that you read, but not in the same way. Just not in the same way.
Yeah, recently I was talking about something, and somebody was asking me about, you know, the very labyrinthine path this novel took to publication. And at one point I said, well, you know, I almost gave up on it multiple times, and what kept me going was I was in love with the characters, and I felt like, if I don't finish this, they're not in the world, then nobody ever meets them. And so I was very moved by this, as I was saying. And my ex-husband, who's one of my best friends, was on, and I didn't know. He sent me a private message that said, "Thank you for your service." It was like such a jackass move, and I was laughing my head off. It's like, yeah, you know, on the one hand, it's so true, and you and I can totally understand. On the other hand, it's just like, yeah, I do like to live in my head. You know what I mean?
It's the best place.
Both things are true. And you know, so also good to have that kind of like humility and somebody poking at you about it.
Yes. Yeah. I get very little sympathy from anyone who loves me about my tortured soul.
Yeah.
Like, no one needs that. And
it's a self-torturing soul, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
No, it's
well, it's so lovely to talk with you again about this, and I can't wait for our paths to cross in real life someday, and we can continue this conversation and you know, and know each other better. I feel like I know you so well through this book and through these couple of chats we had.
a wonderful way to meet you through the book.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And I've enjoyed Northernmost so much, and thank you, Moon Palace, for
thanks.
giving us the space to do this.
Yes, thank you both. That was wonderful and fun. And we will have a link that we'll post. So for people that couldn't tune in, they'll be able to check it out. And yeah, it was so great having you all.
Yeah, thank you
Very much.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.